One of my favorite stories in the Framemaking Sale, and there are many, is what we often refer to as the Capital Review Board story. This is a story that was shared with me and about 70 heads of sales in a chief sales officer meeting I was doing in Chicago a number of years ago. And we were talking about how customers can get stuck in their sales process and that they kind of get lost in the complexities of the decision making in their own organization. And a head of sales shared the following story. He told the room, again, this is, 69 of his peers in sales, all sitting there listening, have all been there before. And he's telling the story of a multi-million-dollar deal that they were doing recently, which was going, it was moving through the funnel. It was doing extremely well. It was, in the funnel with a high percentage likelihood to close on it because they'd been working on this deal for, just over a year. And it was, $10-15 million deal. It was one of the biggest deals in the history of this company. And it was going to make or break the quarter. And the quarter close was coming up and everything was on track. So this was going to make them all heroes. Then they ran into a problem. The problem was the customer effectively disappeared on them. Right up at the finish line, they stopped answering emails, they stopped taking calls, they essentially black holed on the supplier. And you can imagine they started sweating bullets. As I thought we had something here and what's going on and we need to get this thing closed so that we can all have our champagne moment. And so they, of course, are calling the customer, they're emailing, they're texting, they're sending flowers to the assistants or whatever they've got to do to shake this customer loose and just kind of get the paperwork done. And nothing seems to be working until finally at one day, shortly, a couple days before the quarter close, the customer does in fact reappear on a call. And what becomes immediately evident in the conversation with the customer is they had in fact been avoiding the supplier, but they hadn't been avoiding the supplier because they didn't see the value of their solution. You know why they were avoiding the supplier? Because they were embarrassed. They were embarrassed because they ran into an obstacle inside their own company that they just hadn't anticipated. They loved the supplier. They loved their solution. They were excited to buy it. They were excited to implement it. They saw the value. They wanted to go, but what they didn't see was an obstacle inside their own organization. And that obstacle was the fact that this deal, because it was so large, not only was one of the biggest deals this company had ever sold, this was also one of the biggest purchases this particular stakeholder had ever made in his organization. And he didn't realize that for deals of this size, they need, in fact, to go in front of the Capital Review Board for approval before purchase. And as he's explaining this to the supplier, he says, guys, I'm really excited to work with you. And the supplier's like, I thought we had something. We really want to partner with you. We're looking forward to moving forward. And the customer's like, yeah, I'm with you. I know, I agree. But it turns out that arguably the 4 worst words you can ever hear in sales. It turns out that the deal this size has to go in front of the Capital Review Board. And we can't get it done until we get their approval. Now, by this time, the head of sales who's on this call is doing all the right things. Don't worry, we got you. We'll get on a plane. We'll fly out there tomorrow. We're happy to sit down and meet with the Capital Review Board, give you all the talking points you need. We can be there if you want, or we can just support you from the, behind closed doors and give you all the tools and the charts and the data. Just whatever you need, just say the word, and we'll make sure that this all gets done in the next couple of days, so we can get this across the finish line, so we can all get started. And the customer this is when it got really awkward. Said, no, you don't understand. That all sounds great, and I'd love the help, but the Capital Review Board doesn't meet for another 3 months. And there goes the quarter number. So it was really interesting, by the way. It's a true story. In Chicago, is this head of sales is telling the story. Like the other heads of sales in the room are all going, ooh. Like you could feel the air go out of the room because they'd all been there before and they all knew. And by the way, the story does eventually have a happy ending. 6 months later, they did eventually close this deal, but they were joking about that. But in the room, one of the heads of sales is kind of muttered under his breath, that really hurts, doesn't it? I think he actually said something much more colorful, but you get the idea. And the head of sales who's telling the story, here's where we get to the punchline and the point. He sat there and it got kind of quiet in the room as everyone's kind of reminiscing about their own painful customer story. But the head of sales looked around the room and he says, but you know what? He says, you know what we now do and not what we ask on every single call going forward? And the room kind of leaned in and said, what? And he said, we ask every single customer now, do you have a Capital Review Board? Because if you do, you're going to want to get them involved early, because when they get involved late, oftentimes that can be really delaying things, because they often don't meet, but once every 3 months or 6 months. And we have found in working with other customers like you that it's good to get this in front of the capital review board as quickly as you can. And by the way, when you do that, they're going to have 3 questions primarily, and here's the questions they're going to ask. And we've already built the deck that you need. So in other words, notice what he's done is he's making lemonade from lemons, right? It's like maybe not on that customer, but he's learned something, this head of sales and his team, to say this is a coaching moment, a teaching moment. This is a framing moment where we can now share this experience with other customers going forward in the form of the phrase that frames. And working with other customers like you, one of the things we've learned is that for deals this size, oftentimes the capital review board needs to get involved. And here's how to do it and when to do it. And here's how to make your life easier so that you feel better about making progress on this decision, because we'd hate to see this thing wipe out right at the last minute, because that's frustrating for everybody. And from the customer's perspective, more often than not, their reaction is, oh, thank you, I hadn't thought of that. And that's what, just a light version, a nudge, if you will, of framing that can become so powerful. If you're going to become your customer's guide or coach or Sherpa and guide them through their own internal purchasing process, these are the kinds of ways that you can do it, which are not only very powerful, but they're also very valuable. And the whole idea is to learn from past customers, both the successes they've had in buying and some of the mistakes they've run into, things that they didn't see going on or happening, or potentially obstacles they didn't anticipate inside their own organization. Each becomes a teaching point or a coaching point for that next customer. So you can give your customer a heads up about your capital review board situation or their capital review board situation in their own company, and help them avoid that landmine before it's too late.